of Gita, it would be Doug Greene. He doesn't scare the people from the DPA.
I don't. I actually work with the people from the DPA, or at least part of the DPA. So I am going to be as brief as I can be because it's late. I know we're all tired. Just to set this up, when Dana asked me to do this presentation, what I thought he was asking me to do was do something about the comparative efficacy of Ibogaine as a treatment for opioid dependence, which it's classically used for. It's studied a lot, as compared to other substances. But I quickly discovered that you really can't do that. In terms of comparative efficacy, and I'll get to the difference between efficacy and effectiveness in one of the first few slides, but you can only really talk about comparative efficacy, first of all, if you're doing a formal research investigation, like a randomized controlled trial, and it's two different interventions focusing on the same disorder. For example, a conventional, what's the anti-Parkinson's drug called? Senomet. Like Senomet versus a low-dose protocol of Ibogaine for Parkinson's. Or if you're going to do something like, say, a combination of medication-assisted treatment with methadone or buprenorphine for opioid dependence, with a manualized follow-up like CBT or 12-step or something, and compare that with the same intervention but with Ibogaine. That you could do comparative efficacy. Can we get the presentation on screen? Oh. I mean, I also have it on my computer, but... oh, but he wasn't. Anyway, so what the presentation is called is the long-term effectiveness of Ibogaine as a treatment for dependence on substance. And in terms of phraseology, I think it's important we be accurate. Oh, one important thing before Jeremy comes in. It's called long-term effectiveness. Some people were talking this morning about one of the reasons I think I was skeptical about Ibogaine, and a lot of people are skeptical about Ibogaine, is because it was described as a cure. And that, first of all, as being a sort of rational evidence-based person, well, we had people in our scene, actually, who were with Howard and Norma and Dana and myself, some people who work closely with us, like Fred Gottbetter and Rob McDonald, and unfortunately, they had access to many, many Ibogaine treatments. And they eventually wound up resuming using and, unfortunately, ODing and dying. So, a cure is generally accepted to be as something that's a long-term thing. I quickly realized from working with Dana that, yes, people had tremendous short-term outcomes, but it didn't always necessarily last. There was the question of aftercare or continuing care, and that's really important. But another phase in my Ibogaine work started, I would say, about 6 years ago. I actually went and worked with Anwar and was like, well, besides advocating for this, what's it like to work with this drug? And as part of my education, I started learning about drug treatment. And yes, this is it. This is the first thing. So one of the things you learn, there's a great book called Slaying the Dragon by one of the historians of drug treatment in the U.S. called William C. White is his name. And if you research the history of drug treatment, there were many drugs across the ages that were touted as cures. And they actually turned out to be, in a lot of cases, completely bogus medicine, things that didn't work, that relied on the power of suggestion. So when you say the word cure to a drug treatment professional, it really sets them off. So the question is, what is its long-term effectiveness? Okay, great. Next slide, please. So I was saying before the difference between efficacy. Dana asked me about efficacy and effectiveness. So efficacy is proving a desired effect in a formal research investigation, like a randomized controlled trial. Effectiveness is causing the effect in patient care, which is what we are trying to do when we administer Ibogaine. We're trying to make it effective, hopefully for the long term. Next slide, please. What do we consider long term? So that's the question. So in the United States, we use a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Disorders. It's currently in the 5th edition, DSM-5. In pretty much the rest of the world, there's a system called the International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD. The most recent version is the ICD-11. And they have in there a category called sustained remission. And I give an example. Here is the code from ICD-11 for sustained partial remission for opioid dependence, which is after a diagnosis and a treatment episode, a significant reduction for more than 12 months, even if there is opioid use during the period, they don't meet the criteria for dependence. And that's basically when someone is treated, if they no longer meet the criteria for dependence, you can't say they're dependent anymore. And so there's also what's called full remission, which is complete abstinence, or an early remission, which is before 12 months have passed. So those are the possible combinations. Next slide, please. So research for long-term efficacy, that should have been changed to effectiveness, I'm sorry, is extremely limited. There's robust evidence of Ibogaine's ability to manage opioid withdrawal in humans and on other non-human animals. Tremendous amount of data that's been done by researchers that this is an effective Ibogaine. But the evidence base for Ibogaine's long-term effectiveness for dependence on substances is not that strong. Next slide. So these are some of the common limitations of Ibogaine research, and when I go through the different studies, I'll mention the limitations of that particular survey design. But small number of participants, not that many people. Once you get to phase 3 trials on the FDA, you're talking about thousands of participants at multiple sites. These have not that many participants, a limited follow-up time for post-treatment. Sometimes it's up to 1 month when a lot of people have been studying the reduction of withdrawal syndrome and cravings. The research only goes up to a month in time. The data on people using after treatment is based on self-reporting or reports of significant others, not verifiable evidence such as like urine screening. Yeah. Yes, people want urine screening. They want other ways other than self-report because, everyone's self-reporting is biased and is subject to sometimes they do. There's also, in a lot of the earlier work, there's a failure to distinguish outcomes because people were using Ibogaine for all sorts of reasons, mostly opioids, but not all opioids. And in some of the earlier work, there's no distinction of the outcomes between participants who have been diagnosed with opioid dependence and other substance use disorders. Next slide. Thank you. Thank you, Alvaro. Okay, so, and Ken mentioned this in his presentation, most current Ibogaine research is focused on opioid dependence. In the initial research in the United States was for cocaine dependence, and this actually, that little piece of text there is exactly from Ken's summary of how NIDA originally started doing research on Ibogaine. There were a series of meetings, and there was a draft protocol for giving fixed doses to people for cocaine dependence. And that project wound up not going further, but that was the first time in the United States that there was some research done. Okay, so this is a study out of Brazil, the first of actually 3 studies that are referenced in this presentation. This is treating drug dependence with the aid of Ibogaine, a retrospective study published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology in 2014. So this is the methodology. A residential private clinic which treated people with substance use disorders, mostly using CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. In Brazil, a lot of the treatment provider scene is dominated by actually psychologists and psychiatrists. All the people in the study were diagnosed to meet the criteria for substance dependence from DSM-4. There were 75 patients, 48 reported lifetime use of alcohol, 61 lifetime use of cannabis, intranasal cocaine, some injected and smoked cocaine, and about 72% of the participants used multiple substances, alcohol, cannabis, and cocaine. One point I should make is also in Brazil, another interesting factor, I think this is generally true in Latin America, is that opioids are not as big of an issue as are stimulants. Next slide, please. So the results. They looked at a number of variables, but the median length of abstinence for patients who were treated once was 165 days, about 5.5 months. As a lot of people have pointed out, and I think a lot of us know, that multiple treatments, and I think this is not just true for Ibogaine. There is general research in the substance abuse field that the more treatment episodes you have, generally the better. And each treatment episode somehow enhances your chance of long-term recovery. So in the case of people who had been treated for multiple times, their median length of abstinence was 252 days, or about a little under 8.5 months. So the limitations of this study, again, self-reporting, the resumed use and abstinence periods was entirely reliant on what the patients who participated were reporting or their close relatives. One interesting thing about the protocol of this clinic in Brazil is that in order to participate in the program, due to the cardiac risks of people who are using stimulants combined with Ibogaine, they had to be abstinent for 30 days, and at some point during the study, that was changed to 60 days. So that's a big self-selecting factor there. All these people who are participants in this had to be abstinent for either a month or 2 months even before getting Ibogaine treatment. And also, patients were only accepted into the program if they agreed to comply with the psychological interventions after treatment. So this is an early study from the Netherlands. We were talking before about Cisco presented about Jan Bastian's role in the early Ibogaine research in the Netherlands. And this was a study he did, I believe he was being supervised, actually, Dana wandered away, by Peter Kaplan, who is another early pioneer of Ibogaine in the Netherlands. And this was a study of the long-term effects on drug addicts. And the questions were, how does Ibogaine affect drug use pattern in the long term? And are the effects limited to altering the drug behavior, or are the medical, psychological, social, and legal aspects? And we're going to talk about this too. There's scales that measure this in certain tests affected as well. So it affects multiple things, not just drug use. So there were early sites like, Ibogaine.nl, early sites in the Ibogaine movement, and they placed ads on these sites. They got 21 responses. People did questionnaires after they were treated, at least once. And then 1 year later, they were sent a follow-up questionnaire. 48%, almost half of the participants did Ibogaine multiple times. So this is the primary drug of abuse right before treatment. As you can see, heroin is slightly over half. A lot of people were on methadone, other opiates, and some number of people for alcohol, cocaine, and crack cocaine, but the vast majority were using heroin or methadone. So this is the results. There was group 1, who quit all substances. That was a little over 20%. Group 3, which is the group that quit all their primary, secondary drugs. He classified them. People had a primary drug of abuse that they were primarily being treated for, or in a secondary substance that they were not in a good relationship with. So the group 3, the people who quit their primary and secondary drugs of abuse, but still used other substances, and that's slightly over 40%. And then group 4, who were still using their primary or secondary drugs of abuse, slightly over 30%. So group 1, this is the group who quit both their primary and secondary drugs of abuse. The average period they were drug-free was about 41 months. The median was 24 months or 2 years. Group 3, which is drug-free of their primary and secondary drugs of abuse, but still continued to use other substances was about 21 months. The median was 4.5 months. And the overall drug-free period was about 22 months, and the median was 6 months. So some evidence for some long-term effects, or medium-term effects, I guess you should say, since this is still less than a year in duration. Next slide, please. Data based on self-reporting, questionnaires, very small sample size, which limits the generalizability of the study. So this marks an important point in history in Ibogaine research. Both this study and the next study were funded by MAPS. And both this study and the next study, you will see if you look at the page numbers, the next study was right after this study in the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse, very prominent peer-reviewed journal in the States. And this is the Kingsley and Ken Alper study, Mexico study. Next slide, as you can see by that. So this, what this study and the New Zealand study, which is following, primarily looked at was not so much drug use and effects on drug use, but the scales based on the Addiction Severity Index Light, which is a very common survey that's used to, to judge when someone's doing intake at a clinic to get an idea of the contours of their substance abuse problem. So it looked at the baseline from, before treatment to a year after treatment. And this is 30 subjects who were diagnosed with dependence on opioids, according to the DSM-4. So the results. Basically, Kingsley and Ken broke it down into favorable and unfavorable outcomes. 12 of the 30 subjects had favorable outcomes, which was defined at retention at 9 or 12 months. So what they did was baseline treatment, 1 month follow-up, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and 12 months. 9 or 12 months with a 75% or greater reduction in the drug use score, which is one of the subscales of the ASI, compared to their pretreatment baseline. There were significantly decreased scores for all post-treatment time points. For the drug use subscale, people were using less. Family social status, meaning more social interactions, better relationships with their families, and legal status measures. As we know, we live in a prohibitionist world. Using illegal drugs gets you in trouble with the law. That improved as well. There was some evidence about opioid use in the prior 30 days. However, they didn't distinguish between individual patients. But at 1 month, 15% of the sample, half of the sample were opioid-free at 1 month. 3 months, it was about a third of the sample. 6 months, 20%. 9 months, 37%. And still, even a year after treatment, there was a third of the sample that had not used opioids in the prior month. Again, limited number of subjects. There was some attrition of the sample over time and self-reporting of data without any lab verification. So this is the next study from New Zealand. Next slide. So there were 14 participants who were seeking treatment for opioid dependence. 71% of the sample at that time were receiving medication-assisted treatment with methadone. New Zealand is a place where it's a lot easier, I think, than in the States to get access to methadone. Verification of self-reported data with random urine screening and interviews with the significant others. It's a similar methodology to the Mexico study that was just and by the way, before we go on to the next slide, Ken mentioned the fact that there is often a great dropout. I think he reported 5 months from maintenance treatment in the U.S. It's expensive. There are a lot of barriers. Doctors are limited to how they can prescribe methadone, where they can give it out. It can't be office-based treatment. That's why we've developed buprenorphine. So there are a lot of barriers for medication-assisted treatment in the States that you also have to take into account when looking at that dropout rate. So the results, again, the drug subscale of the ASI decreased from 0.32 at baseline before treatment to 0.06 at 12 months after Ibogaine was given. And very important quote I pulled from this paper, outcomes, particularly sustained reduction or cessation of opioid use reported by 12 of the 14 participants, are comparable with the success of currently accepted treatments like medication-assisted treatment with methadone. And so these are the percentages of participants who reported urine screen data at different points post-Ibogaine treatment. So 3 months out, 87.5% were negative for opioid screens in their urine. 6 months out, 85.7%, and even a year out, 75% had negative urine screens. One important point I should also say for people who haven't read this study is that one of the participants died during treatment. There was a provider in the north of New Zealand who left the facility and left his wife in charge, who did not have medical experience, and that patient died during the course of the study. Next slide. Limitations of the study: small sample size. People were already part of needing treatment. There was some attrition over time, and partial data sets. Not everyone was able to be followed up by urine screening. The participant pool was filtered by providers who were people who were already interested in the study before seeking treatment. And there was not an ability to verify data with all the participants with urine screening and interviews with significant others. Next slide, please. So this is a study that came out in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies. Joseph Barsuglia, Alan K. Davis is, I believe, at Yale, and Joseph Barsuglia and Martin Palanco are in. He was at Johns Hopkins? He's in Maryland. Then he is at Johns Hopkins. Yeah. There's another research at Yale. Anyway, Martin Palanco and Joseph Barsuglia are involved with the Crossroads Treatment Center, which used to be in Rosario, and I believe they're now operating out of the Avante Institute in Costa Rica. Next slide, please. So they went online and basically during Crossroads Treatment Center has treated a lot of people. They went back and asked people who had been treated there to complete a survey between 2012 and 2015 and there were 88 responses. Next slide. So of the 88 people, a third of the sample reported never returning to using opioids after treatment, and about half had maintained abstinence for 1 year, and a third had claimed to be abstinent for two or more years, and about half the sample reported that even though they relapsed, not a word I like to use, by the way, I like resumed use or some other more neutral terminology, their consumption had decreased from their levels pre-treatment. I think this is an important point, too, because even in the Ibogaine community, there's a lot of emphasis on abstinence. And part of my journey has been realizing that a lot of people don't want to be abstinent. They want a different relationship with their drug of choice, whether it's harm reduction, safer use, abstinence. These are all possibilities, but it's really a very individual thing in terms of how someone wants to change their relationship with drugs. 41% reported that they had been completely abstinent from all opioids for at least 6 months, and that indicated that 11% had eventually achieved abstinence following a relapse on opioids. Again, kind of not really distinguishing that people have different concepts. One of the people I've studied with is an amazing gentleman in New York named Andrew Tatarsky, who presented in 2016 at Tepoztlan, one of the foremost harm reduction psychologists working on psychology and substance use disorders. And he has the idea of people have an ideal use plan of how and when and what they want to use. And I think what we really have to measure is, how do people's ideal use plans differ, once they have the ability to be treated with Ibogaine and take those experiences and integrate them. Next slide. Limitations. These are all people from Crossroads Treatment Center that may have influenced the results. The outcomes may have been different from patients who didn't answer the survey or were unable to be reached. May not be representative of all Ibogaine patients. And another thing, which I think we're going to be talking about later in the conference, what Crossroads does is, and they started doing sometime in between 2012 and 2015, is that within several days after you are administered Ibogaine, you're given 5-MeO. And this may have influenced how people responded to treatment at Crossroads. Future directions, what's next? And this is almost the end of the presentation. Next slide. Randomized clinical trials. This is the gold standard. I mean, from my own personal experiences, we were talking before about measuring Ibogaine versus the entourage effects of all the Iboga alkaloids, which it's very hard to do that with randomized clinical trials, but this is, for people who don't know how a randomized clinical trial works, this is how it works. You have a control group, a placebo group, an experimental group, and the researchers and the participants don't know who's getting what. There's certainly a lot of challenges with doing this with Ibogaine, as people have mentioned before. The question is, what do you use as a placebo? Since people are going to go into withdrawals if they're not administered a placebo that doesn't have some effect on that. There's ethical questions too about putting people into withdrawal. But this is the gold standard of what we need to convince the treatment community. Next slide. So, Dr. Dos Santos is actually going to be wrapping up, I think, on Saturday afternoon. I didn't actually know that when I was preparing the presentation, but they are doing a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, escalating dose phase 2 trial that's supposed to be starting in, originally I think it was supposed to be starting in late this year, but now the start date is supposed to be January, and done in December, both the study and the results. It's at the Universidad de Sao Paulo. This, unfortunately, if you go to, this is a site maintained by NIDA, and this is one of the only things that comes up for Ibogaine besides the 18MC work that Savant had done, but not for substance use disorders, for river blindness, leishmaniasis in Brazil. So more about this on Saturday. Next slide. And this is the final slide. Back in the USA. So Ken was talking a little bit about safety research. And, a lot of people actually don't know this. Most people here are familiar with MAPS, yes? Yes. So anyway, I was actually at a conference in Boston Dana was talking about. I gave Rick a grant for one of the early Mexico studies that Ibogaine was, that the results never wound up being used, but he's still very grateful for that $1,000, which is not a penny, a drop in the bucket for MAPS, but at the time for me seemed like a lot of money. And right now they have been doing a lot of work on MDMA and PTSD. Those phase 3 trials, thousands of subjects in the U.S. at multiple sites, just started. They're also still raising money to try and get MDMA through the European Medicines Agency. Once they're done with that, they really, really, really are interested in Ibogaine. This may be the next frontier for MAPS. And so Rick, Rick says, in the midst of a crisis of opiate-related deaths and dependencies, it's a tragedy that there's no research into Ibogaine. And what he suggests is a $2 million phase 1, phase 2 safety study focusing on heart function. And, this would be a gift to the world. And we really need to be raising money for research. $2 million is not a lot of money. If we had several people chunking in $100,000 or more, we could get this done, and we'd be on the road to FDA, FDA approval eventually of Ibogaine as a medicine. As was said by Cisco this morning, Howard wanted this to be available at hospitals in New York City. So you could go to Beth Israel or places like that and have insurance pay for Ibogaine to be administered by clinical professionals. And this is what we need to get Ibogaine, the beginning of the path to get Ibogaine approved as a medicine in the United States. And I think that's the last slide. Thank you. And thank you for staying. Anwar. I see Anwar.
Thanks, Doug. It was a great presentation. I think you encapsulated everything beautifully. In the beginning, before you started your presentation, you spoke about, Ibogaine has been promoted as a cure. And I think there are two myths that we have to debunk that's important in order for Ibogaine to be more acceptable, because I agree with you, when you tell so-called experts that it's a cure, they just don't want to hear anything, because they've been so well conditioned that there is no cure. Right. The second thing is, which is very important we need to debunk, is this whole concept of being a psychedelic drug. I think because you know that even with Rick Dolman and them are doing so much research in psychedelics, but a lot of the people in the medical experts don't want to use psychedelics in treatment of medicine in any way, because again, they classify psychedelics as those illegal drugs too. So they say, why use a drug to treat a drug? But they seem to be blinded because they are using pharmaceutical medication to treat drug addiction. But because psychedelics are of a different class, now we know that Ibogaine. And the thing is that it's important that we know that Ibogaine is not a psychedelic. So why don't we promote it at what it really is, as you spoke about it being a remogen. The second part of my question or contribution is about, you speaking about getting long-term effects. And what we found to be pretty successful, you mentioned that people sometimes needs to do more than one flood to get a better result. You showed us a study where people did a second flood, and the success rate improved a little bit.
Yes.
What we should also look at is the role of microdosing in improving sobriety and people staying longer for a cleaner period of time. I think that play a very important role in improving the outcome.
Yes. Okay. So let me. Those are both excellent points. In your first point, I think that's rapidly changing. If there's a conference in New York called the Horizons Conference, which happens every year, and I think this is about the 11th year that it happens. And one whole day, the first day of it, is presented, by people from Johns Hopkins and other research universities about all the studies that are going on with psilocybin, with MDMA. Psychedelic medicine has undergone a tremendous renaissance. We see it in the popular culture. All these events are sold out. MAPS is going to be doing their next conference either in 2021 or 2022, and it's going to sell out right away. So I think that really the challenge for us is not so much the researchers not wanting to work with psychedelic medicine, because that has rapidly changed. I think the problem is, number one, the safety concerns, something we have to get over, and explaining to people that it's a medical procedure. You have to be screened and monitored. If you are screened and monitored, it can be done in a safe manner. And the other thing, when you're talking about the psychoactive effects, I think is almost more of a problem with the media, because almost every media story uses the word hallucinations. And for those of us in the room who have used Iboga and Ibogaine, describing the psychoactive effects as hallucinations is grossly inaccurate and perhaps criminal. They're, and highly insulting. You know, the way I like to describe it is that it's like a waking dream where people have both profound personal and transpersonal experiences that give them insight into how they develop their relationship with substances. And framing in that context really, you know, changes your ability to be heard by treatment professionals. In terms of your I'm sorry, what was the second? Microdosing. Absolutely a need for microdosing. I was extremely privileged to work with Sarita and Claire for 2 months in Mexico, where they did a lot of cumulative microdosing, and I really see, you know, in the future, people using that for certain effects, being able to communicate with patients and have them process material while they're, you know, going through a day, and not having them being completely immobile, and, you know, working with this as a, you know, a sort of enhancing, you know, forms of psychotherapy and other kinds of interventions you're doing with the patient while you're microdosing. At the same time, you know, the funny thing is, like, everyone seems to think that, you know, Claire and Sarah don't do large doses, and they do, but it's just much later on in the treatment process. So, you know, I see a role for both microdosing and large doses in, you know, in different contexts of treatment. Absolutely.
But when I mean microdosing, I mean that after you've done the flood, as a maintenance, when you leave the clinic and you go home, I noticed that people who microdose, depending on the product they're using, whether root bark or TA or PTA or HCl, the quantity and the amount and the days, it varies. But I notice that people do microdose, because I find microdosing is dependent on an individual. There's no one size fits all for microdosing.
Right, and I think the problems there, first of all, I think a lot of times, a lot of people in the provider community, like, tend to focus on, well, you know, okay, we reboot, and I've heard this from, you know, prominent clinic people. It's like, okay, we go reboot someone, we make a recommendation to, you know, an established treatment provider, you know, Passages Malibu, one of those really fancy places in California, and, you know, then they might have to come back and get rebooted again. One of the great things about the New Zealand research was that Ibogaine is a prescription medicine down there. Sadly enough, apparently no one's practicing with it right now, and that really needs to change. But you can integrate it into the system, as opposed to people who were part of the Mexico study, most of whom for the United States. Typical, they go down, they get treated with Ibogaine, they come back to a system that doesn't understand Ibogaine, is often, you know, poorly funded, poorly conceptualized in terms of the primitive state of a lot of substance abuse treatment. The problem with microdosing afterwards is, number one, safety. Jamie's going to present on this. Even with microdoses, people can have cardiac effects. It's not completely safe to be microdosing without medical supervision. And the other thing, too, is, of course, legal. I mean, people definitely have and do come back with microdoses of Ibogaine to the United States, but they're also running a legal risk. So those are some of my concerns about that.
Talking about fundraising, do you have a proposal for gathering momentum or some kind of campaign in order to use your influence with Rick and the rest of the other philanthropists who are?
I mean, I don't have a plan, but that's something I would love to strategize with people on. You know, there's a lot of things this community needs. This community does not only need, you know, research in the United States, but the United States, for better and often for worse, is a leader on drugs and drug policy. A lot of the history of international prohibition is based on, you know, the United States. There's a lot of influence in terms of how drug treatment is approached, but we really need to raise money for things like this, for Dr. DeSanto's study. I would love to see money for, you know, I don't know what kind of studies Ken would love to do to follow up on his talk about, you know, secondary signaling pathways in terms of really teasing out this mechanism of action, which is so hard to explain because, you know, when you talk to treatment professionals, they want to know about mechanism of action. And we have to say, this is incredibly complex, and we still don't have it completely down yet. So, you know, it's really a very tough barrier to get through to treatment professionals. I have tried to get an article published, which has actually been used by a professor at NYU of psychology to present on Ibogaine. And I tried like all the major drug treatment magazines in the United States, and nothing. Like, one of them originally said, yes, we were interested. I went, spent months drafting this piece, revising this piece. They said, no, too controversial, Schedule 1, we're not gonna publish it. So yes, I would love to talk with anyone about raising money for this project.
I have a response to that. Yes. We have started a campaign, and this is one of the reasons I brought you all here, was to introduce you to Ibogaine for the world. The three directors of which at the moment are myself, Anwar, and Jeremy.
Oh.
You know us.
We know you.
We want to lead the fight to raise the millions of dollars. You know that if I can't get it from Peter Buffett, I'm just going to go out and sell pot until we have it.
He will. He will.
So, you know, I'm serious about this. I'm willing to give it my all. I feel, you know, I got a second reel of the movie of my life because I didn't die, right? And I'm bored. This is the only thing I can do, okay? So, you know, join us. You see, there's a little problem with an association of providers being the only ones to work on this. Shouldn't we have some billionaires, right? Providers spend all their time submerged in treatments. Every so often they can put a periscope up and say, what happened in the world while I was giving treatments? But to expect the providers to do it all is unfair. It's just, you know, you want us, we're one hand tied behind our back, and you want us to go out and slay a dragon, fine. So we really want to do this, and, you know, I guess we're going to talk about it on Sunday. Cool. Yeah.
You mentioned about Ibogaine for the world. You didn't tell them the other intention of spreading the word and making, you know, Ibogaine create an interest was also planning. Let me finish, Dana. Dana, let me finish. You spoke about opening up clinics all over the world. That was another plan of action. Am I correct?
That's the other.
Yeah. So that will complement each other in certain way, because the more clinics we see, I think it'll create more interest, and especially we'll be able to spread the message far and wide. Because clinics have been opening up in certain places sporadically, but I think if you see it as much more than what we see, I think that will create a very good interest, and that might able to help us in our research purpose too, because you will have clients and patients, more clients, more patients to study, you know, over a period of different countries in the world.
Thank you for staying to the end.
Back here tomorrow. It's been a very long day, so thank you for persevering. Does anybody interested in watching the film Rite of Passage? If so, put your hand up. If not, then saves me having to. Nobody wants to watch it. Fine. So you want to watch it? Okay, so we'll play it. One person is enough. Okay, so 8:30 we're going to show the film Ibogaine Rite of Passage.
Yeah,